All right. Welcome everybody to Right Hand Technology Group's office hours with an assessor. As always, I would like to thank Matt Gilbert with Baker Tilly for being with us again. For those of you who have not been on one of these, I think most of you have. We started these so our clients can get the assessor's perspective, which is ultimately what matters in the end. So I'd like to thank Matt again for joining us. Matt is not associated with Right Hand Technology Group, so he can be your assessor. No conflicts of interest there. And we highly recommend Matt. So now's your chance to test him out, see if he's got answers to your questions. If you have any questions during the webinar, just raise your hand. We'll unmute you. You can speak directly to Matt, get your questions answered. If you're camera shy, you can use the Q&A. Yeah, Matt, you want to introduce yourself and set any ground rules?
Sure. So Matt Gilbert with Baker Tilly, have been doing IT and cyber with government contractors for 25 years now. Was part of the working group coming up with the assessment methodology for CMMC. Was in the first class of assessors trained. I've been doing CMMC for like 5 years now, helping people get ready. We are in the final throes of kind of the C3PAO authorization, so hopefully we'll be doing some official assessments here very, very soon. Yeah, and otherwise, and I'm on the board of the C3PAO forum, which is basically a bunch of us C3PAOs who are kind of looking out for our interests in this whole ecosystem that's getting stood up. So through that, have interactions with a lot of my peers. So some of the stuff I'll share is kind of not only just my perspective, but what I know others from being in this ecosystem to think or say on some of these topics. And I'm happy to answer any and all questions to the extent I can. I can't give super detailed consulting because A, it's a public forum, and B, you may not want to get so detailed with all your business in a public forum like this, but I'll do my best to answer and give you how I think about things or what some of the considerations would be. So always feel free to ask, and I'll if I think it's going too far or getting too specific, I may say I can't go beyond this point, but I'll do my best as always. Trying to think. Do you want me, Jason, to get into like some recent updates and that kind of stuff, or what? Or do you have questions? What do you want to do?
That was gonna be the next thing I asked. Okay. Any updates you want to share?
Yeah, so I've been getting a number of questions. If you recall from previous ones of these, or just in your travels, there's 2 rules that make up CMMC. The first rule was to establish the program. So what's a C3PAO? Who's the cyber AB? Who regulates who? How does the assessment all work? All of that stuff was done and took effect December 16th. So that's up and running, done. The second part is the actual contract clause that will be in your contract and will invoke the need to get certified. So the clause will in essence say, you need to be certified at this level in order to receive this contract. That has been proposed. All the public comments closed, and everyone has speculated that that would come out this summer. I think it still will potentially come out this summer, but I'm speculating, and I guess I should be very clear. It's kind of my speculation, is that it's probably going to slip more into the fall. The reason I would say that is I suspect within the DoD, the person who's responsible for procurement and contract clauses such as this is a position known as the DoD Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. That role is a political appointee, and that individual is through the subcommittee hearings and is, I believe, sitting on Congress's schedule or calendar for them to take up and vote, and do that whole process. I suspect because CMMC will very heavily impact them, because if there's going to be any concerns or issues with procurements because of bottlenecks or supply and demand of C3PAOs or any of those sorts of things, it's that individual that's going to be dealing with it, right? He's the, or at least it's a gentleman right now that's been proposed. He's the person that does the acquisition. So I suspect that out of courtesy, it's sitting on his desk waiting for him to be officially in that seat. So I think he's been on Congress's schedule for about a month now. I think there's a lot of politics involved in what Congress takes up or doesn't take up, but I think he probably could be in the queue for another month before they officially vote on him or it gets finalized. So I suspect, let's say my guess is right, it's a month. So in a month he gets approved. It's sitting there waiting on his desk at the top of the pile, and he looks at it and says, "Yep, I'm good with this." Well, then it goes to OMB, and that whole process kicks off. That process is typically 90 to 120 days. So, if he's not in the position for another month, and my hunch is correct that they're waiting for him to be in the position before they send it to OMB, well then, 120 days from a month from now is the fall, essentially. So I wouldn't take that to be a sign that this is not happening. In fact, Katie Arrington, who is famously was the person kind of driving this under the first Trump administration, is now back in a more senior position within the DoD during the second administration. So, and she basically said as much the other day that, the fact that I'm back and what I was doing with CMMC is not a coincidence. Like, CMMC is happening. Like, don't ignore it. So I'm not telling you, oh, it's going to be the fall, like, ignore CMMC. In fact, I would say, hey, we got a great, extra couple of months potentially to get ready, but we should use them to best advantage to actually get ready because it's coming. So that's kind of the biggest piece. So yeah, I don't know, Jason, does that make sense, or push back with questions or comments if if you're hearing different?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if Brian and Colby, if anybody has their hand raised on before I jump into questions.
No, we're good right now.
Okay. So I guess I'll just go into the bag of questions that we've kind of accumulated from clients, and we'll I'm always worried we're not going to fill the hour, but somehow we always do. But if for some reason this time is the time, we'll just call it early if we don't have enough questions.
That's fine. I can talk. Don't worry.
All right. And I guess I'll just throw a hypothetical in front of everything. That way, we're not talking about anybody in particular. Okay. So hypothetically, if we have an enclave environment with no printing, so no paper, no physical CUI, it's stored on a server. That server is locked in a room. Is there issues with the cleaning crew being alone in the building, with that server being locked?
Well, I guess maybe I gotta clarify. Hypothetically, is the door locked to the cleaning crew, or does the cleaning crew have the keys?
I think the cleaning crews. I think it's locked to the server room's locked to the cleaning crew, I believe. In this hypothetical scenario.
Yeah. No, I think you'd be okay in that situation. I mean, the cleaning crew does not have access to CUI. I mean, I'm trying to answer from a compliance perspective, but operationally, I wouldn't hire a cleaning crew that I don't trust, right? So the bar from a CMMC perspective is that you screen individuals, which most people have taken to mean, oh, I have to have a background check. Technically, if you read it in the discussion section, it says you have to establish their trustworthiness. Doesn't mean you have to do a background check. So personally speaking, I don't know that I'd have anybody, as a cleaning crew that I don't have a certain amount of trust with. But sticking with the hypothetical, from an assessor standpoint, if the room is locked and they can't get to that server, in my opinion, you're fine. I mean, that doesn't constitute access to CUI. Now, if they have a key, that feels a little bit less ideal. I certainly might suggest operationally, as inexpensive these days as some webcams, or IP addressable cameras are, like, it wouldn't be too hard to throw a little camera in the thing and, or in that, room with the server, and anytime there's motion detected, sends off an email or something like that, that would become, a couple $100 to set that up, and that would become pretty, pretty compelling monitoring, I would suggest. But, those are things I would operationally suggest to do, but like, if you don't have that, I don't know that that's a compliance failure right on the surface, because they don't have access. That you need at least one physical barrier. So if they don't have access to that, they don't have access to it. You've established that one physical barrier.
Okay, and I guess kind of building on that, you have a maintenance person that's working on the AC unit in that locked server room. What kind of supervision or does CMMC require?
Yeah, so that individual, well, if that individual is in the room and they're a known commodity, and they're like your maintenance person, and you work with them all the time, and you've done a background check on them, and you deemed them to be trustworthy, they could be in there doing whatever whatever maintenance they're doing. If it's we called up a contractor and some random person shows up that you have really no basis for, I would assign somebody to sit with them and supervise what they're doing and making sure that they're not accessing that server or attempting to access that server. I mean, same thing more broadly speaking, like, if you have I'll give a scenario. I have one client that their office is in a kind of a mixed use building, and they have a restaurant. There's a restaurant on the first floor below, and their office suite happens to be on the second floor. And I won't name names, but I guess that restaurant had a roach problem, and they were hiring a crew of exterminator folks to come treat and deal with the bugs that were finding their way into the second floor of the building. And they were like, okay, well, we just told them to come after hours, and we just gave them access. And I said, well, If you've got CUI sitting out, that's a problem. So, they had to think about it, and I think they ended up having somebody stay, and kind of quote unquote supervise them while they were in the space. But if that scenario had played out different, where, like a lot of office buildings these days, they're cubes and desks and stuff like that, but nothing gets stored there. Well, I don't know, they don't have access to CUI, there's no concern. So there's going to be facts and circumstances. So then, like, play that out, like if the exterminator guy is there for the hypothetical client with the server in a locked room. Well, again, if that room is truly locked, I don't know that I'd be super concerned. I mean, especially if you had that IP camera, that if they did smash open the door, you get an alert. I feel like that's a really strong answer from an assessor standpoint. It's like, okay, it's locked. They were walking around all around the office suite outside of that, but none of that has CUI in it. The only place we have CUI is on that server in this locked room. And even if they were to, smash in the door, well, that would cause the motion detector to go off, and we'd know that, there's this video of them coming in the smashed in door. I mean, that to me would be pretty solid.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess if the server's hard drives are encrypted with this validated encryption, does that?
I mean, that's a further, item of. I mean, it used to be. I guess I'm showing how old I am, but it used to be that servers, you wouldn't even have to log into. There was just a console that was like on, and if you sat down at the server, you're just on. You're like the administrator. That is no longer a common practice. So, presumably, even if you sat down there at the server, you'd have to have a keyboard and a monitor and everything else to plug in. And then you'd have to enter a password in, or, if I yanked the hard drive out of the server, if that hard drive is encrypted, I mean, those would all be facts and circumstances that would further, kind of support they don't have access to CUI, so it's not a big deal. But I think, typically as an assessor, if the door's locked, I'm not going to ask all the follow-up questions at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking of some places that have put in, like they don't have a closet dedicated that they can lock it into. So they've bought like locked server cabinets that kind of blend into the room. I don't know if is that considered a one physical barrier since it's a locked cabinet?
Maybe. Like I had one client was like, oh, well, we have a telecommunications, we're in the shared building, and in the basement of the shared building, there's a telecommunications room. And, we didn't have any spaces to put our server, so we just put it down in the telecommunications space in the, ground floor of the building. And there's like 4 or 5 companies that are in that building that all have access to that room. And I said, well, it's fine because, we have a locked rack. I said, okay, fine, like let's go see. So we went down and looked at it, and sure enough, the front of the rack, was locked, but you could just lean around the side of the rack, and like all the cables, all the stuff was right there. You could access it. I mean, I feel like if I had a screwdriver, I probably could have taken apart the rack. So like theoretically it was locked, but it didn't really feel like it was a effective barrier. I guess same thing would be like, oh, I have my office is locked. The door is locked, but there's a big window right next to the door that's wide open. Okay, that's not an appropriate physical barrier. But so yes, I think facts and circumstances would apply, but if the equipment is in a rack and the rack truly is secure all the way around, I think you've established an appropriate physical, barrier. But, facts and circumstances, what seems reasonable. I mean, I got into a big back and forth with one organization where, they were in a first floor office space in a downtown area, and they had CUI like drawings and stuff, on display. And I'm like, anybody walking down the street can look into this window and see, that drawing that's clearly labeled as CUI that's sitting right there in front of the window. Like, that's not cool. And they were kind of like, well, but like, we're supervising it. I'm like, I don't know. For me, that felt like a bridge too far of like, we're supervising it. Well, you can't stop the guy from being outside, walking by, filming what he's doing as he walks by. Like, you're not supervising that. I don't know. I mean, so there's a reasonable balance. I mean, but I wouldn't like, so in that situation, I think they ended up going out and buying or hiring a company to install some like tinted film on the glass. Because I was like, well, you could move, all the CUI stuff out of the rooms that that have the street level glass window. And they're like, yeah, that's not really feasible. So I think they found a reasonably priced tinting, solution that made it so you couldn't see in the window. So, but yeah, I mean, these sorts of questions are like super facts and circumstances based. Same situation, second story. Well, I'm not worried about people walking by with ladders peering in the window. I think if that happens, you might call the police or see what's going on. So like, there's a degree of reasonableness that has to kick in, but I typically am going to fall on the side of, if you've established one barrier, that's sufficient.
Okay. Yeah, it just sounds like, if you're the one putting together the evidence or narrative, you probably want to think worst case and try to find holes in your own thinking. And all right. Brian and Colby, just chime in if anybody comes up with questions.
Will do.
All right. So how do assessors evaluate the adequacy of incident response plans? What must-have elements would help you avoid findings during an audit?
That's a good question. And I think it's an important one to maybe use to pull up the actual controls. So give me 1 second.
All right.
So, not that I want to give you tools to argue with an assessor, but let me share this. Ultimately, so I've got the CMMC assessment guide pulled up. Hopefully that's sharing. Actually, let me make my window smaller because this monitor is huge. Hopefully that's more legible. That's not too small, is it, Jason?
No.
Okay.
Good.
All right. So, as an assessor, I am only able to answer yes, no, or NA to the assessment objects. So, determine if an operational incident handling capability is established. Yes, no, or NA. That's what I can do with that one. And I can't add, this is A through G. I can't add, 15 other things that are my preference. So, so what am I looking for? I'm looking for you have a capability. There's some, the incident handling capability includes preparation, detection, analysis, containment, recovery, So if I can't tell that your plan covers these items, well, now we're going to have a whole bunch of questions and go round and round. So, anytime I've helped organizations, prepare or think about, being ready, it's like, make it obvious for the assessor, right? Have a heading in your incident response plan. Please have a heading that says preparation, and it talks about what you've done to prepare. Please have a section that talks about detection. Like, smack me in the face with it. Make it super obvious. Like, I don't want to be, I don't want to be in a situation where it's like, well, I think that's close enough, isn't it? It's like, like, I'd rather not be there, right? Like, let's make sure you've hit, A through G in this case. Same thing when I go to the, when I go to the next one, A through F, right? Those are what I'm capable of evaluating. So this came up a lot during the working groups. A lot of people said, well, 7012, so the DFARS clause 252, 204, 7012 says you need to have the capability of reporting the incident, and you're supposed to, per 7012, you're supposed to go to dibnet.mil and report the incident. And oh, by the way, you either have to have a CAC card or you have to have a medium assurance certificate, which those certificates are not super hard to get, but it takes a little bit of time to go get one. You have to have those. So if you don't have that, well, geez, how could you possibly say they're fine? There's still a little bit of back and forth among the assessor community, but technically there isn't a determine if, point G, determine if they have a CAC card or, access to the, the DibNet website. It's not there. So technically, I'm probably definitely going to recommend, I'm probably going to scrutinize other parts of your plan, because if you haven't thought through how you would actually communicate, I don't know, like, have you really fully identified the organization officials are notified of incidents, or have you really, determined who needs to be reported? I mean, maybe I could make an argument that the lack of that causes one of these other ones to fail, but in a very direct sense, that's not a direct requirement of the framework. So if you don't have that certificate, I don't get to make it up that it's a requirement. It's a requirement of 7012, but I'm just being asked to assess the 320 of these assessment objects across all the different controls. So if it's not specifically there, I'm not going to be in the business of making up my own requirements to fail you based on. So, so I think that maybe is an important piece to cover. But is there, Jason, what else? Help me remember what else was part of that question that I might not have hit on.
Oh, just the must-have elements to avoid findings during an audit. Sounds like you covered it.
Yeah, I mean, you got to have, the plan's got to have those items that we talked about up here. And you got to have some method to track and document. So most people, I'm going to get a plan. Hopefully it has all those headings and makes it quite obvious that they've addressed all the things it's supposed to address. And then they're going to give me an example of a ticket of recent incident or something like that, and show me how they tracked it, how they documented it, all that kind of fun stuff. A frequent pushback would be, well, we haven't had any incidents, so none of this stuff applies. Instead of getting into an awkward back and forth of like, well, technically it didn't happen, but you need to do tests of your incident response capability. I think that's next one down here somewhere. Yeah, 363. You need to test the capability. So my suggestion would be, if you're doing a tabletop test, you should go create, clearly label it as test, mark it up, do whatever to make it known it's clearly a test, not a real incident. But why not use the same tickets? Because then that at least gives me something to look at back on 362, where I need to say, determine if incidents are tracked, determine if incidents are documented. Well, if the policy says you're supposed to track it in your ABC ticketing system, and you show me a test where you documented it in the ABC ticketing system, that becomes more persuasive than, well, we didn't have any incidents and the policy doesn't really clearly say, but we would definitely do it. Trust us. Like, don't put me in that like awkward position, right? Even if you haven't had an incident, you should have tested it to document the test according to whatever you're supposed to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. I got another one. I think I've heard this a few times. So if our MSP or IT provider is managing part or all of our infrastructure, what kind of involvement or evidence does the assessor need from them during an audit? And I guess kind of adding on to that, like, are they going to be needed on site? Obviously, a lot of MSPs are all remote. I guess tack even more onto it. Some companies have different pieces divvied out to different service providers. I assume they're gonna have to get them all involved, and then obviously, like your SOC provider, MDR provider is probably not going to come on site. So just, I guess, maybe speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah. So in the framework, there is a section of that rule that took effect in December, that talks about your external service providers. And I'm trying to stall to find the section that's helpful and share my screen. But it lays out, kind of what the difference is between the external service provider, external service providers that are actually cloud solutions versus other sorts of external service providers. All right, here we go. Let me share my screen again. All right, so within the federal regulation, so 32 CFR 170 is where all the CMMC rules and structure resides. So let's make sure we clarify a couple things. So an external service provider, if they process, store, or transmit CUI, and they are a cloud solution, so what would be a good example? Like a file sharing repository site. Like I upload CUI to the site, and people down, my subcontractors or my customer downloads it from it, and that website, is run by an external service provider. Well, that ESP is handling, storing or transmitting CUI, and they're a cloud solution. Well, then FedRAMP kicks in. And so we don't really need, as an assessor, I don't really need to talk to them. I can get their FedRAMP stuff. Maybe if there's something weird about, if there's something weird about their FedRAMP package or their shared responsibilities materials that they might have provided you, I might ask you a question, and to get the question answered, maybe they might need to, participate. But for the most part, probably I'm just looking at a FedRAMP package and, life is good. If they're not a cloud service provider, so some of the other scenarios, like, I've outsourced, my IT function to this external service provider, and they're running it from their offices or on their network, and they're running my server that contains CUI. Okay, well, they're in this first bucket, but they're not a cloud service provider. They are part of the assessment scope. So presumably they're going to be participating, whether that's physically in person or that's over the phone. I think that can be somewhat determined. If they are in the scenario I'm talking about, if they have a server that contains your CUI and it's running in their environment, I probably have to go physically see their physical security controls that are in place. So that gets a little bit harder to do virtually. I probably have to schedule time to actually go to their location and see the server. Now, where it gets a little bit different is, okay, well, if they don't have CUI, but they have SPD, security protection data, and security protection data is a little bit nebulous. Logs, configurations, things of that nature is as much as it defines. So there's a little bit of debate in the community about what all is security protection data. But if they have, let's say they have security protection data, and they are a cloud solution, then the services provided are in scope and shall be assessed. So they don't have to have FedRAMP in that scenario, but they would have to be able to explain, what they're doing, how they're doing it. So the SOC example that you gave before, so they've got agents installed on all of your machines. Those agents are reporting back to their central solution, and they are triaging and taking action to apply patches or correct vulnerabilities or whatever. Well, the information that they're collecting back about vulnerabilities or suspicious malicious activity, that all I think would constitute security protection data. So it's in scope. We've got to talk to them. In that situation, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I mean, it sort of depends how they've configured things. But again, I'm probably talking to them a decent amount. If they're not a service provider, probably, or not a cloud service provider, basically same language between these two. So I'm talking to them. If they don't have CUI and they don't have security protection data, it doesn't meet the definition of an external service provider. So, for instance, you engage an external service provider to, what would be a good example? Oh, I was talking about one the other day. The company engaged somebody to be a virtual privacy person. Like this person, the company handles some sensitive PII type data, and they decided they needed to have a privacy person that wasn't just security, but understood some of the privacy implications of what they were doing. So they hired this person as a virtual privacy officer. That person basically, has a call every other week with them to talk about stuff and is available on call, as stuff comes up. Well, we were talking it through, and I'm like, well, do they have any of your CUI? No. We have phone calls with them, but we never send anything to them. Okay. Do they have any of your security protection data? Like, nope. We talk about stuff, but they never get copies of or, get any of that information. Well, okay, in that scenario, while they might know an awful lot about your environment, they never took CUI or security protection data out of your environment and into theirs. They're not in scope. So I think hopefully I kind of hit all the permutations, but I think what gets a little bit tricky is, this language, the services provided are in the assessment scope. Well, that's sort of between you and your assessor as far as like, does it have to be in person? Can it be virtual? Some of that back and forth. That's talk to your assessor. It's probably one of the questions you may want to ask when selecting an assessor. Are you open to this? We don't want to pay to fly this guy out to talk to you for 45 minutes. You good to do it, over Teams or virtually? In my case, I'd say, yeah, sure, that seems reasonable. I'm not making you incur a whole bunch of costs, nor do I want to fly out there. Well, and I mean, unless it's maybe Hawaii or someplace super nice, maybe I'll want to fly there. But jokes aside, I mean, I talk to your assessor on some of these. They should be made aware of any external service providers when you're talking about and kind of scoping out or pricing your assessment. But yeah, I would. There's a little bit of wiggle room as far as like exactly how they participate. Okay. Oh, and the one thing I didn't mention, which may be the case, if they have obtained a CMMC certification before, or if they, like let's say all you're letting them store is security protection data, but they've got, so they don't have to be FedRAMP, but they just happen to be FedRAMP, or they happen to be CMMC certified. In that situation, I think your assessor has some wiggle room to not necessarily talk to them and could leverage some of that information, but some of that would be facts and circumstances dependent. Like how, if that CMMC certification was from 2.5 years ago, I'm getting a little bit leery of like, well, how do I know that's still accurate, right? Versus, they just got it a month ago. Okay, I'm probably good to rely on it. So, there's some judgment in there, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, obviously this is our world, so I'm like, just as you're talking, thinking about where's the line, because a lot of MSPs, that their tools are in the cloud, right? They use ConnectWise or Kaseya or some other cloud hosted tool.
Yep.
So the security protection data is going into, say Kaseya's cloud. We're using the tool. So is Kaseya then in the OSA or just the MSP?
It starts to get to be a slippery slope. I was talking to a university, and the university wanted or is in the process of establishing an enclave. And they said, okay, we're going to have this separate enclave. It's, totally physically, logically separated. You'll have to access it with virtual desktops, all that nice stuff. But they said, what really stinks is that like, we don't want our users to have to remember a different username and password. Well, we're going to hook up that environment to our, their Active Directory. Wasn't exactly Active Directory, but their LDAP or kind of equivalent of an Active Directory solution. And their same username and password can be used. And I said, well, hey, time out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of these tools now are, right? Whether it's the RMM getting Windows logs or it's a cloud-based SIM collecting logs, where you're managing the endpoint protection software. All right. What about legacy infrastructure, like unmanaged switches, kind of just dummy switches? Do those need to be upgraded to something manageable, or are they just kind of out of scope?
So there's nothing that back to my assessment objects. There's no assessment object that says, you know, determine if all the switches are managed, you know, devices, or, you know, are within the certain, you know, age or something like that. So technically there's not a specific assessment object that you'd be at issue with. It sort of depends on, it would sort of depend on how other things are architected. Like if that device is encrypting your network traffic and it's not FIPS validated, well then, not because it's an unmanaged switch, but because it's not FIPS validated encryption, you might need to upgrade or replace. So it's sort of facts and circumstances, but if that switch is not responsible for something else that's a specific assessment object, knock yourself out. Have your old switch as long as you want, I suppose.
Okay. What's the best way to document exceptions to standard practices, like needing admin rights for a certain piece of software to work, or skipping, the other one I have here is skipping like session logouts, like for some reason a machine can't be automatically logged, or maybe it's running some kind of analysis?
Yeah, so as an assessor, I don't like to hear we skipped it. I want to hear that you have mitigated the risk by using, by something else, or you've compensated for it by doing something else. In that scenario, I'm going to be I'm going to be more inclined to, you know, hear you out and listen to. I mean, if you're just kind of like, well, it didn't work, so I didn't even try. Like that's, and I don't think that's what you're suggesting per se, but just trying to, you know, make example of kind of the worst example I've seen. I always would suggest you want to have any of the gray area stuff, you know, the stuff where you're like, like the assessment object says this, I don't exactly do that, but I think I do enough, or I think I've managed the risk because I did something else. I would have that on a list and talk to, you know, the assessors that you plan on hiring. I would talk to them ahead of time, even before you've, you know, signed the contract for them to do the assessment. I would say, hey, I've got this oddball situation, and this is what we did. And, you know, I've got a little memo here that explains, you know, well, we couldn't exactly do this because it broke the software, but instead we did this, this, and this. And we think the risk is really low because of this, this, and this reason. You know, that's why we think we're fine. If you come to me, you have that kind of thought process and you say, hey, we want to get your thoughts up front. We wrote this little memo. Can you read it? I'm going to read it if it makes sense and I think it's fair and reasonable. I'm going to tell you I think it's fair and reasonable. If it seems like you're like way out on a limb that I can't, you know, I can't follow that or agree with that, I'll tell you. I mean, hopefully none of the other assessors out there say, oh yeah, it's fine. But you know, I would certainly encourage you to have it documented. Like I said, a little, you know, doesn't have to be a novel, but you know, here's my points for why I think it's okay and how I've mitigated or addressed the risk. You know, and then talk about it. Be upfront. If an assessor's not willing to talk to you, you know, as you're selecting them and talk through some issues like that, I might not go with that assessor because they don't seem to be somebody who's like reasonable to work with. But hey, you know, your decision. But might as well ask the question up front and see how they react.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume some of that comes down to credibility as well. Like if everything, you know, if there's a million exceptions, then you're probably going to be like, okay, you're just not doing anything versus, you know, you've really got everything else on point and you just have this one. Okay, because I know, like, you know, we used to have a manufacturing client that used ANSYS and it ran these like calculations for like days. And, you know, we know about it because, you know, you put a reboot schedule in for patches. And you blew away a day's worth of analysis. So that's, you know, I guess that's one of the examples you could see. Or a test floor where there's a kind of a master workstation that's collecting the testing data. The tests are running for extended periods of time, and if that thing goes offline, you just wasted all that testing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some there is specialized assets. So like some of the scenarios you're talking about, like if I'm running test equipment, well, that test equipment might qualify under the definition of specialized assets. And then I get I get more of a pass from the CMMC requirements. So, you know, keep that in mind as well, right? Like that could also be part of your rationale is like, hey, this meets the definition of a specialized asset. Therefore, but yeah, I totally agree with your point. Like there will be a tipping point at some point where it's like, you know, I had a client say to me, they're like, okay, well, you know, it says I'm allowed to define the frequency for which I'm gonna do vulnerability scans. Well, you know, that vulnerability scanning software was kind of expensive, so I'm gonna define the frequency as once a year. Okay, I mean, technically the assessment object says they need to define the frequency. They defined it as once a year. And then the next assessment object says, did they do this according to whatever frequency they defined? If they did it once a year, technically I'm following the assessment objects. But I said to them, I said, okay, well, I guess you got me on that point, maybe. But I guarantee you, you know, if you're playing like that and I feel like you're trying to kind of find loopholes and bend the rule, A, you know, hopefully I'll discover that before I sign you up as a client. But B, you know, I'm gonna scrutinize some other stuff, and if there's, you know, if you're doing that across the board, I don't know. At some point, there's gonna be something else you slipped up or missed. And I'm not saying I don't want to fail people, but I also, like, if I certify somebody who was like, you know, bending all the rules and playing like funny with it, that they get hacked, and then the DoD calls me up and says, "Hey Matt, why did you certify this company that only does vulnerability scans once a year?" You know, I don't want to be in that situation, right? So, you know, so there's a certain amount of litmus test that I'm gonna do before I agree to take on a client. Like, I think you should expect to provide your SSP to the assessor for them to kind of do a little bit of that litmus test before they agree to do the assessment. And if I see a bunch of red flags like that of like, man, they're playing fast and loose or interpreting things in a very strange way, I might choose to just not want to be your assessor, because I don't want to have to explain it to the, I don't want to fail you. I don't want to take your money and fail you, and or I don't want to take your money past you and then have to explain it 6 months later to the DoD, and then they take away my, you know, authorization to do the assessments. So, I mean, it is a little bit of a two-way street, right? Hopefully most assessors are, and in my conversations with them, most of them are trying to find clients who are taking this seriously, doing it the right way, because A, they're going to be better to work with, but B, there's less risk there than, you know, if somebody, if you get the vibe that somebody's super shady, I don't know that I want to be the assessor for that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm sure after all that effort, the last thing you want to do is get to the end and just say, yeah, you failed.
Yes. I'd much rather, I mean, I'd much rather say you pass. But even if, I'd much rather catch it super, you know, like I'd much rather look at the SSP and be like, whoa, this is not even close to where it needs to be. Like, you know, let's not proceed. And, you know, I can kind of explain why I wouldn't want to proceed, but I'd much rather be in that situation than in the, you know, we're on the Thursday of a week-long assessment and we're, you know, reaching the conclusion that it's going to fail like that. I got to call the balls and strikes. You know, like I can't bend the rules, but I'd rather not be in that situation. I'd rather catch it early.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think we made another hour.
All right.
Anything, you have anything coming up that you want to share, or?
No, not right now. Just staying busy. So happy to talk if you need anything. bakertilly.com/CMMC. Otherwise, happy to talk again in a month or so.
Yeah, appreciate it, Matt.